We are a channel NPA Discovery dedicated to the archaeology of the human spirit. We don't just read the headlines of history, we dig into the subtext, the psychology, and the raw, unfiltered reality of the icons who shaped our world. If you are looking for surface-level trivia, you might want to look elsewhere. But if you want to understand the soul of greatness, you are exactly where you belong. Today, we are dissecting a man who was arguably the single most important voice in 20th century American comedy. A man who didn't just tell jokes, he performed open-heart surgery on society, and on himself, every single night. We are talking about Richard Pryor. The title of today's deep dive is The Fire Inside. And I want to address that immediately. Confronting the legend. You've heard the labels. Jerry Seinfeld called him the Picasso of our profession. Chris Rock called him the Rosa Parks of Comedy. I have to respectfully disagree with those titles. Not because they aren't complimentary, they are immense honors, but because they are too clean. They are too tidy. To call Richard Pryor the Rosa Parks of Comedy implies a quiet, dignified resistance. Richard Pryor was not quiet. He was a scream. He was a riot. He was the sound of glass breaking in a church. To call him Picasso implies he was dealing in abstract art. But Pryor wasn't an abstract artist, he was a hyperrealist. He painted in blood, sweat, and bodily fluids. A more accurate title might be the Vincent van Gogh of comedy, a man so tortured by the beauty and horror of the world that he eventually consumed himself in the process. Richard Pryor was not a character, he was an exposed nerve ending. And to understand the fire that he famously set to his own body in 1980, we have to understand the fire that was lit under him the day he was born. A quick request before we begin. We are about to embark on a very long, very emotional journey through the life of a genius. This kind of analysis takes time and passion to produce. So, before we step into the darkness of Peoria, Illinois, please take a second to hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that deep, thoughtful content still matters. Share this video with someone who truly appreciates the art of stand-up, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Factate. Join us as we uncover the truth behind the legends. Now, let's go back to where the trouble, and the magic, began. The Architecture of Trauma, 1940 to 1958. They say that comedy is tragedy plus time. But in Richard Pryor's case, comedy was tragedy plus survival. To understand the man who would one day sign a $40 million contract, the first African American to do so, we have to look at the soil he grew from. And let me tell you, that soil was toxic. Richard Pryor wasn't just born into poverty, he was born into the underworld. Born in Peoria, Illinois, his very first address was a brothel. His grandmother, Marie Carter, wasn't baking cookies, she was running a house of prostitution. His mother, Gertrude, was one of the women working there. His father, Leroy, was a hustler, a pimp, and a former boxer. Analytical insight, the child as an observer. Let's pause and analyze the psychology of a child raising themselves in a brothel. Most children are shielded from the transactional nature of adult intimacy. They are taught that love is pure, unconditional, and safe. Young Richard learned the exact opposite lesson before he could even tie his shoes. He learned that intimacy is a commodity. He learned that affection is something you buy, or something you steal. Imagine being 5 years old, peering through a keyhole, as the records show he did, watching your own mother engage in sex work. This isn't just troubling, this is foundation shattering. It creates a dissociation between love and sex that would haunt Richard for the rest of his life. It explains his later inability to maintain a marriage, his rampant infidelity, and his confusing view of women as both saints and sinners. He was programmed to see relationships as transient and transactional. But the trauma wasn't just observational, it was visceral. The source material mentions he witnessed his mother attacking his father with a knife. He saw bar fights next door. He found a lifeless baby in a shoebox. These are scenes from a horror movie, but they were Richard's Tuesday afternoon. The theory of normalization, when a child is exposed to extreme violence, their baseline 4 normal shifts. Peace becomes boring, chaos becomes comfortable. This is why, later in life, when things were going well for Richard, when he had the money, the fame, the beautiful wives, he would inevitably self-sabotage. His nervous system didn't know how to process peace. He needed the chaos to feel at home. The Architecture of Trauma, 1940 to 1958. They say that comedy is tragedy plus time. But in Richard Pryor's case, comedy was tragedy plus survival. To understand the man who would one day sign a $40 million contract, the first African American to do so, we have to look at the soil he grew from. And let me tell you, that soil was toxic. Richard Pryor wasn't just born into poverty, he was born into the underworld. Born in Peoria, Illinois, his very first address was a brothel. His grandmother, Marie Carter, wasn't baking cookies, she was running a house of prostitution. His mother, Gertrude, was one of the women working there. His father, Leroy, was a hustler, a pimp, and a former boxer. Analytical insight, the child as an observer. Let's pause and analyze the psychology of a child raising themselves in a brothel. Most children are shielded from the transactional nature of adult intimacy. They are taught that love is pure, unconditional, and safe. Young Richard learned the exact opposite lesson before he could even tie his shoes. He learned that intimacy is a commodity. He learned that affection is something you buy, or something you steal. Imagine being 5 years old, peering through a keyhole, as the records show he did, watching your own mother engage in sex work. This isn't just troubling, this is foundation shattering. It creates a dissociation between love and sex that would haunt Richard for the rest of his life. It explains his later inability to maintain a marriage, his rampant infidelity, and his confusing view of women as both saints and sinners. He was programmed to see relationships as transient and transactional. But the trauma wasn't just observational, it was visceral. The source material mentions he witnessed his mother attacking his father with a knife. He saw bar fights next door. He found a lifeless baby in a shoebox. These are scenes from a horror movie, but they were Richard's Tuesday afternoon. The theory of normalization: when a child is exposed to extreme violence, their baseline 4 normal shifts. Peace becomes boring, chaos becomes comfortable. This is why, later in life, when things were going well for Richard, when he had the money, the fame, the beautiful wives, he would inevitably self-sabotage. His nervous system didn't know how to process peace. He needed the chaos to feel at home. Critical analysis: this was a spiritual betrayal. Richard Pryor, the boy from the brothel, the abuse survivor, the soldier who stabbed a racist, was up there telling gentle jokes about schoolyards. It was a lie. And the thing about lies is that they are incredibly heavy to carry. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. Every night, he walked on stage and pretended the world was a nice, funny place. Every night, he suppressed the rage, the pain, and the absurdity of his actual life. He was successful, yes. But he was hollow. He was feeding the audience what they wanted, but he was starving his own soul. He felt like a fraud because he was a fraud. And the pressure of that fraudulence began to manifest in dangerous ways. The Hollywood Paradox, The King Who Couldn't Wear the Crown, 1974 to 1980. Welcome back to the story of the fire. In part 1, we watched Richard Pryor claw his way out of the brothel and onto the stage, turning his trauma into the rawest comedy the world had ever seen. By the mid-1970s, Richard Pryor was no longer just a comedian, he was a cultural phenomenon. He was a rock star with a microphone. But as he transitioned from the smoky clubs to the bright lights of Hollywood, a new tragedy began to unfold. It is the tragedy of the uninsurable genius. The Blazing Saddles heartbreak. To understand Richard's relationship with Hollywood, we have to look at the movie that almost was, Blazing Saddles. Mel Brooks, the legendary director, hired Richard to help write the script. And if you watch that movie today, you can hear Richard's voice in every line of dialogue spoken by the character Bart. The satire, the biting racial commentary, the absurdity, it's pure Pryor. Richard didn't just write it, he was supposed to star in it. He was supposed to be the sheriff. Analytical insight, the corporate wall. Mel Brooks fought for him. But Warner Brothers said no. Why? Because by 1974, Richard Pryor's reputation had walked into the room before he did. The studio executives looked at him and didn't see a genius, they saw a liability. They saw the drugs, the arrests, the unpredictability. They couldn't insure him. Imagine the devastation. He wrote the words, he created the soul of the character, but he wasn't allowed to wear the badge because the industry deemed him too damaged. He had to watch Cleavon Little play the role he birthed. This rejection confirmed Richard's deepest suspicion: they love my talent, but they hate me. It fueled a resentment against the Hollywood machine that would fester for years. The perfect foil, Gene Wilder. Despite the Blazing Saddles loss, Hollywood couldn't ignore him forever. They found the perfect vessel for his chaotic energy, Gene Wilder. Their partnership in films like Silver Streak and later Stir Crazy created the blueprint for the interracial buddy cop movie, think Lethal Weapon, Rush Hour, 48 Hours. But why did it work so well? Psychological chemistry. Gene Wilder was neurotic, gentle, and internal. Richard Pryor was explosive, street-smart, and external. Wilder grounded Richard. When they were on screen together, Richard seemed safer. Wilder was the straight man, not just in comedy, but in spirit. He provided a calm center that allowed Richard to orbit without spinning out of control. But this was only on screen. Off-screen, the gap between them was widening. The nightmare on the set of Stir Crazy. By 1980, Richard was filming Stir Crazy, a movie that would go on to be a massive box office hit. But the production was a horror story. The source text mentions Richard's demands: a special helicopter to fly him to set, firing a camera operator because he imagined an insult. Deep dive, the anatomy of paranoia. We need to stop calling this diva behavior. That's a tabloid term. What Richard was experiencing was drug-induced psychosis. By this point, Richard wasn't just using cocaine recreationally. He was freebasing, smoking chemically pure cocaine. This delivery method hits the brain instantly and intensely, but the come-down is devastating, and the side effects include extreme paranoia and hallucinations. When he fired the cameraman for looking at him wrong, it wasn't arrogance. In Richard's chemical reality, that cameraman was a threat. His brain was telling him he was under attack. Gene Wilder later admitted he didn't realize it was addiction at the time. He just thought Richard was difficult. This shows how good Richard was at hiding the depth of his sickness. He could be hallucinating in his trailer, then walk out, deliver a brilliant comedic line, and walk back into the darkness. He was a high-functioning vessel of chaos. Superman 3 and the Sellout. Then came Superman 3. Richard was paid more than the Man of Steel himself, Christopher Reeve. Critical analysis. This film represents the nadir of his artistic integrity. Richard Pryor, the revolutionary who spoke truth to power, was now playing a bumbling computer hacker in a slapstick superhero movie. It was a paycheck role. He famously said, "I'm not making enough money for this gig." That quote is tragic. No amount of money is enough when you are selling your soul. He took the role to fund his lifestyle, the drugs, the alimony, the entourage. He had become a slave to his own overhead. The Rosa Parks of Comedy was now falling off buildings in a Superman cape for a laugh. The self-loathing this must have caused cannot be overstated. The sexual void and the search for stimulation. Before we get to the fire, we must address the other fire that consumed him, his insatiable, confused sexuality. The revelation by Quincy Jones, and confirmed by his widow Jennifer Lee, that Richard had a sexual relationship with Marlon Brando shocked the world. But if you have been paying attention to his childhood, it shouldn't shock you at all. Psychological commentary, the fluidity of trauma. Richard grew up in a world where sex was transactional and ubiquitous. Boundaries did not exist. For a man like Richard, who was constantly chasing the next dopamine hit, whether from a laugh, a line of coke, or a lover, gender was likely irrelevant. He was chasing sensation. He was chasing a connection that could silence the noise in his head. His relationships with women, Margot Kidder, Pam Grier, the 5 wives, were characterized by a frantic intensity. He loved hard, and he hated hard. The New Year's Eve incident, the story of him shooting his car, a Mercedes, with a .357 Magnum while his wife's friends were there, is often told as a Crazy Richard story. But look at the mechanics of it. He felt disrespected. He felt crowded. So he introduced a lethal weapon into a social situation. This is the act of a man who feels powerless without a gun. He destroyed the car, a symbol of his wealth and success, because he hated the symbol. He was trying to kill the rich Richard Pryor, who was trapped in a life he couldn't control. He was screaming for help, but he was screaming in a language of violence that terrified everyone around him. The fire, June 9, 1980. And now we arrive at the defining moment of his life, the night the fire moved from the inside to the outside. The official story versus the truth. For years, the story was that it was a freebasing accident. That the ether used in the process ignited. But his widow, Jennifer Lee, and Richard himself in later years, confirmed the darker truth. It was a suicide attempt. The scene, it is June 9, 1980. Richard is in his mansion. He is surrounded by millions of dollars of art and furniture. He is the most famous comedian on earth. And he is in hell. He is hallucinating. The drug psychosis is at its peak. He believes there are people trying to get him, but the real enemy is in the mirror. He pours 151 proof rum over his body. He strikes a lighter. The symbolism of self-immolation. Why fire? Why not a gun? Why not an overdose? Fire is biblical. Fire is purification. Richard Pryor felt dirty. He felt stained by his childhood, stained by the industry, stained by his own actions. In his psychotic state, he likely believed that fire was the only way to burn away the Richard Pryor that he hated. He wanted to melt the mask off. When he ran down the street, burning, he wasn't just a man on fire. He was a living metaphor for what he had been doing on stage for 20 years, burning himself alive for our entertainment. The survival, he suffered second and third degree burns over 50% of his body. Doctors said he should have died. But Richard Pryor was unkillable. The resurrection, the recovery was brutal. Debridement, the removal of dead skin, is one of the most painful procedures in medicine. For months, he lived in a world of agony. But something miraculous happened in that hospital bed. The drugs were gone. The entourage was gone. The noise was gone. For the first time in decades, Richard Pryor was sober. And he was alive. When he returned to the stage for the concert film, Live on the Sunset Strip, 1982, the world saw a different man. He walked out in a red suit, a nod to the fire. He was slower. He was gentler. And then, he talked about the fire. He turned the most horrific, painful moment of his life into a 15-minute routine that had the audience howling with laughter. He struck a match and asked, "What's this?" Richard Pryor running down the street. Artistic analysis. This is the greatest magic trick in the history of comedy. He took his own suicide attempt, a moment of absolute despair, and transmuted it into joy. He reclaimed the narrative. He took the power away from the fire and gave it to the audience. It was an act of supreme bravery. The long fade, The Body Betrays the Mind, 1986 to 2005. The fire didn't kill him. The drugs didn't kill him. The heart attacks, 1977, 1990, didn't kill him. But nature has a cruel sense of irony. In 1986, Richard was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, MS. Think about Richard Pryor's comedy. It was kinetic. It was physical. He was a rubber-faced, limber, acrobatic performer. He acted out the dogs, the horses, the heart attacks. His body was his instrument. MS is a disease that attacks the central nervous system. It slowly unplugs the body from the brain. The cruelty of the disease: for the last 20 years of his life, the man who could not sit still was forced into stillness. The man who had the sharpest tongue in America eventually lost his ability to speak clearly. It was a slow, silent prison. But there was a silver lining. The source text mentions that Richard considered MS a blessing in disguise. Why? Because it forced him to stop running. He couldn't run to the clubs. He couldn't run to the dealers. He couldn't run to the next woman. He had to sit. He had to be with himself. It was during these years, cared for by Jennifer Lee, the wife he divorced and remarried, that he finally found the one thing he had been chasing since he fell in the dog poop in Peoria: peace. He became an advocate for animal rights. He fought against animal testing, even though that testing could have helped cure his own disease. That is a profound moral evolution. The boy who saw violence everywhere became a man who wanted to stop suffering, even if it cost him his own hope for a cure, the legacy, the tree that Richard planted. Richard Pryor died on December 10, 2005. But look around. He is everywhere. Eddie Murphy put on the leather suit because of Richard. Chris Rock paced the stage because of Richard. Dave Chappelle walked away from $50 million and went to Africa because he saw what the industry did to Richard, and he refused to let it happen to him. Richard Pryor didn't just influence comedians, he liberated them. Before Pryor, black comedians had to code switch. They had to be safe. Pryor proved that you could be black, angry, vulnerable, profane, and absolutely authentic, and the world would still buy the ticket. He broke the sound barrier so everyone else could fly. Thank you for sticking with us through this epic journey. This has been one of the most intense stories we have ever covered on NPA Discovery. If this video moved you, if it made you think, or if it just made you appreciate the genius of Richard Pryor a little more, please, smash that like button. It helps us keep the lights on. Leave a comment below. What is your favorite Richard Pryor moment? Or, who do you think is his true successor today? Share this video. Real history deserves to be seen.